Well, but what to you is the single sort of biggest piece of evidence in your mind that Bond died of a heroin overdose?
The fact that you have Zena Kukuli, who I mentioned earlier, Peter Parrott's wife, Kula Kukuli, who was Zena's sister. You have an interview with Peter Parrott where he also says to the French journalist that he believes Bond died of a heroin overdose. So potentially 3 eyewitnesses.
Mm.
I then have a 4th person called Liz Elliott, who I spoke to for this book, who was a friend of Alistair Kinnear, who says that literally Alistair Kinnear turned up in her apartment the next day and admitted that he'd given heroin to Bon Scott.
Mm.
Circumstantially, that would suggest that heroin is involved in Bond's death. Mm. The other people who were involved in sort of Bond's last 24 hours, let's go through it. Silver Smith, his ex-girlfriend, who was a heroin user and part-time dealer. Pete Way from UFO, who was a heroin user. Paul Chapman, who told me, also from UFO, who was a heroin user, who told me before he died that Bond had gone off that night to buy heroin, and that Paul Chapman and their mutual friend Joe Fury had been back at Paul Chapman's house in London waiting for Bond to return with the smack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is Bond hanging out with Alistair Kinnear, who was a well-known heroin dealer in London at that time? And Liz Elliott, who I speak to for this book, also confirms that Alistair was a big-time dealer, that he was dealing in high-grade smack. I don't think there's any sort of great secret about that. So there's nothing in the death certificate, obviously, that says anything about heroin, but there's no autopsy. There's also the issue of what his blood alcohol content was. So he was supposed to die of alcohol poisoning, but his blood alcohol reading, I think, was half of what Amy Winehouse's was when she died, right? And she was a small, tiny woman.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Bond was a prodigious drinker. So, John Bonham died of, vodka shots, but, his blood alcohol reading was like double what Bond's was. So I think the whole thing is incredibly fishy. And that logic and Occam's razor all points to heroin being the culprit. And also, Bond had already had 2 heroin overdoses that we know about.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like he was a complete newbie to this drug. He'd had overdoses before. He obviously had a problem with it. And where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's a lot of fire in this story.
Why do you think, even when presented with all the evidence that you presented, and like why do you still think there are so many AC/DC fans that won't lend themselves to that possibility, that just absolutely rule it out? I mean, literally, there's amount of evidence, there's amount of people around that situation at the same time that are all saying the same thing, all pointing to the same thing, and yet there's still a lot of AC/DC fans kind of with their heads in the sand. If they don't want to know, that's one thing, but when they when they just come out and flat out deny and then argue against, I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, I get very irritated when people sort of say, "Oh, I'm just in this to trash AC/DC." That I've got nothing but an agenda, some personal agenda, to sort of crush the Young family and crush Brian Johnson, which is complete nonsense. I started on this whole AC/DC thing, writing a tribute book to AC/DC. There was no hostility involved. But basically, as a journalist, I ended up writing the story that people were telling me, which was, like in the book The Youngs, that the AC/DC was this mega business that had crushed a lot of people, that there were a lot of victims of AC/DC's business practice. A lot of people had sort of been discarded along the way. So what I ended up writing was, to some minds, a very unflattering book. But I didn't go into this one, wanting to annoy people any further. In fact, I actually started writing the book basically setting out to kind of document Bond's life on the road from 1977 to the end of 79 in the United States, which was the last highway of the title.
Mm.
That was my focus. I actually didn't even want to get into the stuff about how he died. I actually wanted to avoid that. And I had read Clinton Walker's biography of Bond, and I had thought that was really kind of the last word on the matter. But then I started investigating it myself, and I realized so much of what Clinton had written was not correct. And I think that people cling on to the mythology of Bon Scott more than they do the real man. That they like to think of Bon as this Peter Pan of rock, who could, drink all he wanted, drink anyone under the table, would have two girls on his arms, would get completely smashed, yet, wake up fresh as daisies in the morning and be punctual and sort of charm everyone's mother, and, this bullshit. They like to hold on to this idea of Bond as this sort of person, right? And they're the people who will put Bon Scott on the cab of their truck, or they will get a Bon Scott tattoo, or the people who are running Bondfest in Scotland. That's the image of Bond that they hold dear. And I understand that, because I think that it's important to them. It gives them a sense of rebellion, or whatever it is, that it sort of alleviates their own boring life to kind of perpetuate this myth. But then there are people that that I've met along the way, kind of writing these books, who also love AC/DC, love the music, especially the Bon Scott era, but are very open to kind of learning who Bond was as a real man. And those people are incredibly supportive of me and all the work that I've done in that regard.
Mm.
And then there's this lunatic fringe, who are the people sending the death threats, who are threatening to beat me up, who, the people on acdcfans.net, the forum, which, they will say that I'm only doing this, for money, that I'm making it all up. I mean, seriously, if I was going to make it all up, it would have all been done in 2 years. I've spent the better part of a decade working on these 3 books, right? I could have made it a lot easier for myself if I had fictionalized it all. And I haven't fictionalized anything. Anything in my books is based on a piece of research. What the weather was, for instance. I could have, sort of made more dramatic scenes by kind of just, pretending what someone was wearing, or what the weather was, or, it would have been so easy to do. But I'm very, very serious about kind of making sure that every part of my book is sort of thoroughly researched, and that if I'm going to make a statement, that it's based on some sort of fact. So that really, really irritates me. But they've got nothing else to kind of say, though, because they don't come to me and say, hey, you're actually wrong here. This is what's wrong with your book. You've got this fact wrong, and I can prove it. No one's actually come to me and said that, because they can't. And if I'm unsure about something, I am always very careful to say I don't know what the definitive truth of this matter is, but I'm going to leave it up to you, given the available information, to come up with your own kind of conclusion about what happened, such as the death of Bon Scott.